If you're a fan of Star Wars, chances are you're as much a fan of Kit Fisto as we are. This legendary Jedi Master got up to some insane stuff during the Clone Wars, especially depicted in the comics. He was also incredibly easy to recognize with his green skin, black liquidy eyes, and multiple head tentacles. This made him stand out amid the rest of the Jedi cast, but it wasn't an unusual description of his species. Kit Fisto, as you probably already know, was a Nautolan, one of our personal favorite amphibious species in the galaxy. In today's video, we'll be doing a deep dive into everything that made them and their society tick.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
As we just mentioned, the Nautolans, also known as the Nautoloids, were an amphibious humanoid species from the planet Glee Anselm. This was an ocean world with almost no land masses. Once, long ago, it had continents, but they had all sunk to the ocean floor millennia ago. Although they were capable of living outside of water and breathing air, the Nautolans made their home at the dark depths of the ocean floor. This, of course, affected the way their psychology evolved. Size-wise, they were pretty much as tall and heavy as the average human. What made them stand out were those amphibious traits that evolved to survive so far underwater. The first of these was their skin, which could be a variety of colors, from grey and blue to yellow and orange. Unlike our own porous skin that eventually becomes waterlogged if we're in water too long, the Nautolan's skin was more like that of frogs and other amphibians. It was designed to keep the ocean where it was supposed to be, outside the body. They also had exoskeletons and dense cartilage that made them sturdier than the average squishy human. Another aquatic adaptation was their webbed fingers and toes, which allowed them to swim super fast. Their eyes had also adapted to their underwater home. Since they lived so deep underwater, they lived in what we call the aphotic zones, the zone of the ocean where light no longer reaches. To help them make use of the tiniest motes of light, their eyes evolved into those black, liquidy beauties we know and love them for. These specialized eyes not only helped them see, but they were also designed to actually function while continuously exposed to water. We would wager they had some sort of nictitating membrane like crocodiles or frogs, a thin translucent second eyelid that covered the eye and protected it from water while allowing them to see, but that's just our guess. We're pretty confident in it, however, as Nautolans were known for almost never blinking. If they had a protective eye membrane, that meant their eyes never lost moisture. They'd never have to. Naturally, they could also breathe underwater. We don't have clear confirmation of how they did it, but given their neighbors called them gillheads as an insult, we'd wager a guess that they relied on gills to filter oxygen out of the water. They also had multiple hearts that beat independently of one another, presumably to deal with the huge water pressure and cold. Another fun, interesting fact about the Nautolans' biology was the way they reproduced, which was pretty much exactly the same as frogs. They lay eggs, and baby Nautolans hatched as tadpoles. Infant Nautolans slowly grew arms and legs as they developed, though for several years, these new limbs were too weak to support them on land. This meant that baby Nautolans were pretty much confined to the watery parts of their homes. Something we do know more about were the long, wiggly tendrils that grew out of their heads and floated around them in water or laid against their backs when on land. Nautolans had 14 tentacles in total, but they weren't a uniform shape or size. Most tendrils also had patterns on them, such as spots, rings, zigzags, and so on, which were also seemingly random. Also, unlike Leku, there were no long-term consequences of a tendril being cut off. It never grew back, but it didn't result in any kind of brain damage. Regardless of their size, shape, or pattern, all tendrils were highly sensitive organs. More specifically, they could sense chemicals in the water around them, such as pheromones. See, we knew that word would get your attention. At least in the Nautolans' case, it was a far more wholesome use than what the Zeltrons did, for example. By sensing the pheromones others gave off, Nautolans were able to understand what others around them were feeling. This was super helpful because of the darkness around them. With very little light to see by, Their tendrils helped the Nautolans piece together others' emotional states and body language without needing to rely on sight. As you might imagine, communication was especially challenging to the Nautolans. Under all that water, they had to rely on emotions, their rippling language that couldn't really be replicated on land, and looking deep into each other's eyes. Their language, Nautala, heavily relied on pheromones to the point where words weren't even necessary. These chemical indicators were so complex that they could convey the meaning of a full sentence or even something as complicated as coordinates on a map. Now that we've given you a rough background of how they lived, you'll be able to better understand how their society functioned the way it did. If you've seen Kit Fisto interacting with practically anyone, you might be tempted to assume that most of his fellow Nautolans were just as laid back and chill as he was. And you'd be right, for the most part. The first Nautolans had lived in caves, but with time, the species evolved to spread themselves across the ocean floor in open water. And they did incredibly well for themselves. Nautolans were big proponents of respecting the balance of nature, represented by what they called the ocean spirit. They were peaceful folk that just wanted to live in harmony with each other and Mother Nature, avoiding unnecessary fighting and arguments. Even the way they built their society was designed to be harmonious. Local settlements were centered around families, and each settlement sent a council of elders to form the central government. Nautolans mated for life and supported loyalty and equality among all their members. This peace-seeking attitude is what made them so generous with everyone, other Nautolans and species alike. They gave of their wealth willingly, which was very kind of them, but as you can imagine, it eventually came to bite them in the tentacles when their watery neighbors started to get a little too carony. Enter the Anselmi, the other aquatic species that lived on Glee Anselm. In the beginning, they and the Nautolans got along splendidly, but with time, the Anselmi grew jealous of their wealth. They began encroaching on their territory, stealing and generally threatening them despite the Nautolans' previous generosity. Despite the constant threats and provocations, as we mentioned before, the Nautolans tried to avoid conflict when possible. Instead of launching counterattacks, they warned the Anselmi that if they continued on like that, it would anger the ocean spirit. Presumably, the Anselmi didn't really care. What they did care about, however, was the possibility of open war. When they realized they were heading down that path, they chose to abandon the oceans of their world and move onto one of the few land masses still on the ocean surface. On their new terrestrial home, the Anselmi continued to lust after wealth and fortune. They began constructing dams to hold back the ocean itself and expand their territory, which upset the Nautolans greatly. Again, the Nautolans chose diplomacy over war and sent ambassador after ambassador to try and reason with the Anselmi, but each and every one of them was sent away. And then, disaster struck, just as the Nautolans had warned it would. A huge storm destroyed Anselmi's empire in what the Nautolans took as a sign of the ocean spirit's anger. The landmass the Anselmi had been trying to expand sank below the waves completely. The few that remained devolved into constant infighting that diminished their numbers even further, all while the Nautolans continued living peacefully. So, what do you think? Were you as surprised as we were to learn that Nautolans laid eggs and were born as tadpoles? What species would you like us to talk about next? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.